It was a busy evening at a high-end restaurant, the kind of place where waiters glide between tables with effortless charm. Among the bustling crowd, a well-dressed woman quietly took a seat near the window. Her presence was confident, yet understated. She was here for a casual dinner, just like any other guest, or so it seemed. The waiter assigned to her table, a young man with a sharp attitude, walked over with a hint of impatience. From the start, his tone was clipped, his demeanor cold. She greeted him politely, but he barely acknowledged her. As the interaction unfolded, his comments became pointed, even laced with subtle jabs. And then, out of nowhere, he muttered something under his breath, something unmistakably racist. The woman froze, the insult hanging in the air. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink, and all the bustling energy around her dulled into background noise. She met the waiter's gaze, her expression calm but piercing, her silence louder than any words. Unbeknownst to him, this was no ordinary customer. This woman wasn't just anyone. She was connected to the very heart of the restaurant. As the waiter turned to leave, oblivious to the storm brewing, she reached for her phone, setting the stage for what would come next. What happened afterward would not only leave the staff stunned, but change the course of that waiter's career forever. As the waiter walked away, the woman's fingers hovered over her phone screen. She wasn't the type to act impulsively, but the sting of his words lingered. She glanced around the room, taking in the lively atmosphere, the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, the soft glow of chandeliers. No one else seemed to notice what had just happened. It was as if the moment only existed between her and the man who had dismissed her with such disdain. Her husband's restaurant had always been her pride. They had built it from the ground up, pouring countless hours into making it a place where people felt welcomed and valued. Every detail, from the decor to the menu, was a reflection of their shared vision. She had spent years behind the scenes, ensuring that everything ran smoothly, but she rarely made herself visible to the staff. It was an intentional choice, her way of staying grounded and letting the team shine. Tonight, though, something felt different. It wasn't just about her. It was about the values they had worked so hard to uphold. She placed her phone down, deciding to observe for a while longer. Maybe this wasn't the first time this waiter had treated someone like this. Maybe others had endured his behavior silently. As the evening went on, she watched him closely. He moved efficiently, but his attitude seemed to shift depending on who he was serving. With some guests, he was polite and accommodating, his smile practiced and professional. With others, especially those who didn't look like they fit the usual clientele, his tone was curt and his gestures dismissive. It was subtle, but once noticed, it was impossible to unsee. Her thoughts drifted to the other staff members. Most of them had been with the restaurant for years, forming a tight-knit team. They were like family, treating every guest with warmth and respect. This waiter, though, was a relatively new hire. He had the credentials, the experience, and the charm, at least during the interview. But now, cracks in his polished exterior were becoming glaringly obvious. She flagged down another server, a young woman she had known for years. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Can you tell me the name of the waiter serving this section tonight?" The server hesitated, her expression guarded. "That's Jake," she replied. "Is everything okay? Did something happen?" The woman offered a reassuring smile. "I'm just curious. Thanks for letting me know." She didn't want to cause a scene or make anyone uncomfortable. Not yet. There was still more to understand before she took any action. As she sat there, her mind raced with questions. What had led Jake to behave this way? Was it ignorance, arrogance, or something deeper? And how many other guests had left this restaurant feeling the way she did now? Unwelcome, disrespected, unseen. A few tables away, a young couple caught her attention. They looked nervous, glancing at their menus as if unsure of what to order. Jake approached them, his demeanor shifting once again. His tone was sharp, almost condescending, as he made suggestions. The couple exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of them spoke up. It was clear they didn't want to cause trouble. The woman felt a pang of anger. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who walked through those doors expecting a good meal and a welcoming atmosphere, only to be met with someone who seemed to think they didn't belong. By the time her meal arrived, she had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let this slide, but she also wasn't going to handle it in a way that would embarrass anyone or escalate the situation unnecessarily. There were better ways to address this, ways that would lead to real change. After finishing her dinner, she stood up and made her way to the front of the house. The manager, a kind-hearted man who had been with the restaurant for over a decade, greeted her warmly. "Good evening," he said. "Was everything to your satisfaction?" She gave him a knowing look, lowering her voice. "We need to talk. Privately." His expression shifted to concern, and he immediately led her to the office in the back. Once the door was closed, she explained everything. What had been said, what she had observed, and how she felt it reflected on the restaurant as a whole. The manager listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying little. When she finished, he let out a deep sigh. "I had no idea," he admitted. "Jake seemed like a great hire on paper, but if this is how he's treating our guests..." "It's not just about him," she interjected. "It's about what this represents. If someone like me can be treated this way, imagine how others might feel. This isn't just a one-off issue. It's a chance for us to look at our culture, our training, and how we hold people accountable." He nodded again, his expression resolute. "You're right. We need to address this, and we need to do it carefully. Thank you for bringing it to my attention." As she left the office, the weight of the evening began to lift slightly. She knew this was only the beginning. There would be difficult conversations, and not everyone would react well. But she also knew that change often started with uncomfortable moments like these. Jake, meanwhile, remained unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. He continued his shift, moving from table to table with the same mix of charm and indifference. Little did he know, the woman he had dismissed so easily was about to become the catalyst for a turning point in his career and the restaurant's future. The next day, the restaurant buzzed with the usual energy. The staff flowed seamlessly from one task to another, ensuring that the evening service would be as flawless as the one before. But underneath the surface, a palpable tension lingered. It was subtle, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, unnoticed by most but impossible to ignore if you knew what to look for. The manager had spoken to the owner earlier that morning, discussing the situation in full detail. They agreed to take swift action. Jake, unaware of the storm he was about to face, entered the restaurant that evening with his usual swagger, his uniform freshly pressed, his confidence high. He had no idea that things had already begun to shift beneath him. As the shift began, the woman returned, this time more deliberate in her presence. She wasn't there for dinner, but rather to observe. She slipped into a quiet corner, her eyes scanning the room, watching the way the team interacted, noticing everything. Jake didn't seem to acknowledge her at first, but the woman knew the moment he did. It wasn't anything obvious, just a slight change in his posture, a tension in his smile when he made eye contact. He knew she had been the one to speak up, but he couldn't quite place how much trouble he was really in. The night was unfolding as usual, with guests coming and going. But with each passing moment, the woman's patience grew thin. She could see how Jake interacted with some of the other guests. A couple came in for a special occasion, and Jake's initial greeting was less than warm, his service indifferent. He didn't seem to make the effort he had with more familiar customers, and the couple appeared uncomfortable. She could sense the disconnection, the unspoken divide that Jake created without even realizing it. Still, she remained in the background, careful not to draw attention to herself. Her husband had always warned her about the dangers of making a scene, of letting emotions take over in the heat of the moment. She would have to handle this carefully, strategically. She knew that her next step needed to be calculated, measured. As the evening went on, the restaurant grew busier, and Jake's attitude seemed to shift even further. His interactions with certain guests became more sarcastic, almost mocking at times, as though he were testing boundaries. The woman watched him carefully, noting every small detail, and it became clear Jake was feeling the pressure. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and it wasn't long before he began to unravel, his usual polished demeanor slipping further. Then it happened. Jake approached a table near the back, where a family of 4 was seated. The father, a regular customer, greeted Jake with a smile and an attempt at small talk. Jake didn't even return the greeting. Instead, he began to rush through the order, barely making eye contact with the guests. The father hesitated, clearly taken aback by the dismissive behavior. His wife exchanged a look with him, and the tension in the air was unmistakable. The woman, who had been sitting at the bar, suddenly felt the familiar feeling of discomfort return. She wasn't sure why, but something about the scene unsettled her. She watched closely as Jake served the family, his words short and his tone clipped. At one point, the father tried to make a joke, but Jake simply nodded without a laugh, his eyes already darting elsewhere. It was rude, unprofessional, something she could no longer ignore. Before she could stand up to intervene, the family's youngest child, no older than 7, spoke up, her voice loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "Why is he so mean?" she asked, her small face creased in confusion. The room fell silent for a split second. Everyone froze, the question hanging in the air like a fog. The woman's heart clenched. She didn't want this to escalate, but the child's words were like a sharp blade cutting through the tension. It was one thing to observe Jake's behavior, but to hear it pointed out so plainly by someone so young made the reality of the situation undeniable. Jake, suddenly aware that all eyes were on him, stiffened. He attempted to brush it off with a forced chuckle, but it was clear that the moment had completely derailed. The parents exchanged an uncomfortable glance, and the woman felt a growing sense of unease. She knew that this could not go unaddressed, not anymore. As the evening continued, her thoughts were already on the conversation that was about to take place. She would wait until the end of the night to confront Jake, not in front of the guests, but in a private setting where they could talk without interference. But even as she tried to focus, her mind kept drifting back to his behavior, the way he had treated people, the sense of superiority he had carried around with him, and the way he clearly didn't think twice about making others feel small. The night dragged on, and with each passing minute, the woman's resolve grew stronger, but she was also conflicted. Was she doing the right thing? Was this truly the best way to handle it? She knew that confronting Jake could lead to a confrontation, and who knew what that would mean for the restaurant, for the staff, for the team she had come to see as family. Then, just as the evening was winding down, Jake approached her table. He had been ignoring her all night, but now something in his posture told her that he knew the moment was coming. He stopped just a few feet away from her and cleared his throat. "Everything okay tonight?" he asked, his voice forced and uneven. The woman met his eyes, steady and calm. "Actually, I think we need to talk." Jake's expression faltered, the facade slipping for the briefest of moments. He glanced around, clearly trying to gauge the situation. Sure. What about?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everything that had led up to this moment. The small moments of disrespect, the subtle racism, the arrogance. It was about the future of the restaurant, the team, and the values they all held dear. "I'm not here to make a scene, Jake," she said, her voice steady. "But I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Jake shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the other staff members who were still cleaning up around the room. The tension was palpable, and in that moment, neither of them could look away from the other. It was as if everything had led to this one, unavoidable moment. But before either of them could say another word, the restaurant manager stepped in, his voice firm but calm. "Jake, I think it's time we had that conversation. The storm had arrived. The manager's entrance had shifted the dynamics of the conversation in an instant. Jake's shoulders slumped, and his confident facade all but disappeared. For a brief moment, the woman's gaze flickered toward the manager, hoping for some form of resolution. But instead, she saw the uncertainty in his eyes. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a simple confrontation between a disgruntled guest and an overworked employee. There was an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. The manager motioned for Jake to follow him, and the two stepped toward the back office, their voices low. The woman remained seated, unsure of what to do next. She had anticipated a swift resolution, but the more she observed, the more she realized this was far from a straightforward situation. She had expected Jake to be the only one with secrets, but as she sat there, something nagged at her. The manager's uneasy expression, the way he had interrupted at the crucial moment. What was going on behind closed doors? Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The woman's heart raced as the weight of the situation began to settle deeper into her bones. She had done her part. She had spoken up. But now, everything was out of her control. The fate of the restaurant, of the team, and of Jake hung in the balance. It was a delicate dance. One false move, and everything could crumble. Her thoughts were interrupted when one of the other waiters, a young woman who had been working at the restaurant almost as long as the manager, approached her table cautiously. She looked over her shoulder, then leaned in close. "You didn't hear this from me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "But there's something you should know. The manager, he's not just concerned about Jake." The woman frowned, unsure if she had heard her correctly. "What do you mean?" The young woman glanced nervously toward the back office before continuing, her voice dropping even lower. "It's not just Jake's attitude that's been a problem. The manager, he's been protecting him." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her mind raced as she tried to process what the server was implying. Why would the manager protect Jake? And from what? "I don't understand," the woman said quietly, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Why would he protect someone who's been treating guests like that?" The young woman bit her lip, clearly torn. "There's more going on than you know. Jake's not just a bad employee. There's some history between him and the manager. Stuff from before he ever worked here. I don't know all the details, but I've heard things. People have been talking." The woman's stomach churned. What kind of history could the manager have with Jake that would explain his behavior? And what could be so serious that it would make him turn a blind eye to all the warning signs? As the minutes dragged on, she felt the sense of unease grow even stronger. She couldn't sit back and let this happen. She had to know the truth. Everything. There was too much at stake now. She stood up from the table abruptly, causing a few heads to turn in her direction. Her movements were swift and purposeful as she made her way toward the back office, determined to uncover the secrets she now suspected lay behind the scenes. The door to the office was slightly ajar, and she hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The room fell silent as she stepped inside, her eyes locking onto the manager and Jake, who were seated across from each other. The tension in the room was thick, and the moment she entered, the air seemed to shift. Both men looked up, their faces betraying nothing but a cold, guarded expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman said, her voice steady but sharp, "but I think we need to talk." The manager stood up quickly, his face going pale. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone strained. There was an edge in his voice now, something she hadn't heard before. "This isn't the time." "No," she said, her voice unwavering. "This is exactly the time. You've been hiding something, haven't you? There's more to this situation than just Jake's behavior. Why don't you tell me what's really going on?" For a moment, neither man spoke. The manager's eyes flicked nervously toward Jake, who sat in the chair with his arms crossed, a smug expression slowly creeping across his face. It was clear that whatever they had been discussing, he wasn't worried. In fact, he seemed almost pleased that the woman had walked in. Finally, The manager sighed, his shoulders plumping. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. "Try me," the woman replied, her patience wearing thin. She wasn't going to back down. She needed answers. The manager exchanged a long, silent look with Jake before he spoke again. "It's not what you think. Jake has connections, people in high places. He's not just an employee here. He's been involved in things that I can't discuss." The woman's mind whirled. What kind of things? Jake's smile widened at her confusion, and he leaned forward slightly in his chair. "You really have no idea, do you?" he asked, his voice laced with a false sweetness. "You think this is all about me being rude to a few customers. Oh, it's much bigger than that. You've stepped into something that's out of your control. You should have just stayed in the background." The woman's pulse quickened. She had always trusted the manager, always thought of him as a pillar of integrity. But now, with his cryptic words and the way Jake seemed to take pleasure in the situation, doubt began to creep in. What exactly was Jake involved in? And why had the manager chosen to protect him? Before she could respond, the office door opened abruptly. A familiar face, someone she had never expected to see, stepped into the room. It was one of the restaurant's investors, someone whose name had only ever come up in passing conversations. But the moment she saw him, she felt a chill run down her spine. There was something about his presence that immediately shifted the balance of power in the room. "I think it's time for everyone to understand the real stakes here," the investor said, his voice cold and calculating. "This isn't just about Jake. This is about keeping things running smoothly for everyone. You've all been kept in the dark for too long." The woman's heart raced as she processed the weight of his words. Whatever this was, it was much more than she had ever imagined. The stakes had just been raised to a level she couldn't have anticipated. The restaurant, the team, and even her own safety were now in jeopardy, and she had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. The investor's presence seemed to freeze the room. His sharp gaze cut through the tension like a knife, and for the first time, the manager appeared truly nervous. Jake, too, looked unsettled, his usual arrogance replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The woman felt a rush of adrenaline surge through her mind racing as she tried to piece everything together. What was going on? How had she gotten tangled up in something far larger than she had imagined? The investor's eyes flicked to the woman, his lips curling into a thin, amused smile. "I think you've seen enough, don't you?" he asked, his tone laced with coldness. "You've heard enough to know that you're in over your head." The woman stood her ground, refusing to back down. "I don't know what you're involved in, but I know enough to see that it's wrong," she said, her voice steady but full of defiance. "I won't let you manipulate everyone here." The investor's smile didn't falter. "Manipulate? No. Control? Absolutely. You're not the first person to get curious about things that don't concern you. You're just the next in line to learn a very important lesson. This restaurant isn't just a business. It's a tool for something much bigger." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her mind spun as she tried to digest what he was saying. "A tool for what?" she demanded. "What exactly is going on here?" Before the investor could answer, Jake stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His posture had shifted completely. Gone was the smugness, replaced by a more calculating demeanor. He walked toward the woman, his eyes cold and sharp. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice lower now, more serious. "This place, your husband's restaurant, it's just a front for something much larger." The woman's heart skipped a beat. Her pulse quickened, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. "A front for what?" she demanded, her mind still racing to catch up. Jake's lips parted in a tight, sinister smile. "You've been building an empire here, but you've had no idea what it's been built on. Your husband's success, it's been carefully orchestrated. The people who dine here, the way this place operates, it all serves a purpose. But it's not about good food or good service, not anymore." Her thoughts crashed together, a whirlwind of confusion and realization. You're saying, all of this, the restaurant, the business, everything we've worked for, is connected to something illegal. Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he nodded slightly, and for the first time, the woman saw a flicker of guilt cross his face, but it was fleeting, almost imperceptible. Then the investor stepped forward, his cold smile still intact. Illegal? The investor repeated, his voice a mockery of disbelief. Oh no, it's much more than that. This place has been used as a front for money laundering, trafficking, and worse. Your husband may have been unaware of the depths of it at first, but he's involved now, whether he likes it or not. The woman's chest tightened, and a wave of nausea washed over her. Her mind reeled, the room spinning as the shocking truth settled in. Her husband, a man she had trusted, loved, and built a life with, was implicated in something far darker than she could ever have imagined. The betrayal was too much to process, and her hand shook as she struggled to hold herself together. The investor took a step closer, watching her carefully. We've been using this restaurant to move money and connections for years. It's a well-oiled machine, and your husband, whether he realized it or not, is the perfect cover. He doesn't know the full extent of what's been going on, but he's been involved in every step. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. She had to think, to make a plan. There had to be a way out, a way to protect her family and the people she cared about. But the weight of the situation seemed insurmountable. Why tell me all of this now? She asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. Why not just let me keep living in the dark? The investor's gaze was cold, calculating. Because you're asking questions that you shouldn't be asking. And Jake here. He motioned to the young man who had been nothing but trouble from the start. He's been getting too close to the wrong people. He's been sloppy. He doesn't understand how this business works. But you? He paused, looking her up and down. You could be useful. The words hung in the air, thick with implications. The woman felt her stomach churn again, but this time it wasn't just disgust. It was a surge of anger, the kind of fury that threatened to boil over. How dare they? You think you can just manipulate me, use me as your pawn? She shot back, her voice low and dangerous. You think you can make me part of this? I'm not afraid of you. The investor's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. You misunderstand. I'm not asking you to join us. I'm telling you that your life as you know it is over. The moment you walked in here tonight, you became part of something much bigger than you ever bargained for. And now, you'll either work with us, or you'll regret it. Before she could respond, the office door slammed open again. And this time, it wasn't just the manager or Jake who entered. It was her husband. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear as he took in the scene in front of him. What's going on? He demanded, his voice shaking. The woman looked at him, the weight of everything crashing down on her. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice cracking. How could I have known? Her husband's face shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to anger. What have you done? He growled at the investor, stepping forward. This is my restaurant, my business. You can't just take it from me. But the investor only chuckled, a low, mocking sound. You really think you can stop me? This has been in motion long before you even knew what was happening. In that moment, something in the woman snapped. Everything she had believed about her life, about the man she married, was crumbling before her eyes. But there was one thing left she could do. The anger rose up within her, and she made a decision. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, dialed a number she hadn't called in years, and pressed it to her ear. I need your help, she said, her voice calm but filled with intent. The investor raised an eyebrow, a smug smile returning to his face. You think you can fix this? I know I can, she said, her eyes locked on him. And in that moment, the door opened one last time, revealing a familiar face, a face that neither the investor nor Jake expected. The woman's old connections had just arrived, and everything was about to change. The air in the office shifted as the familiar face stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply on the tile floor. It was a woman, someone from the past, someone the woman never thought she'd see again. The sharp, confident gaze of her old friend, someone who had always been a part of the underground world the woman had tried to leave behind, now stood in stark contrast to the tension-filled room. The investor's expression faltered for a brief second before he quickly masked it with his usual smirk. "I see you've decided to call in the cavalry," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Do you really think this is going to change anything?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped toward her husband, who was still standing there in shock. "Listen to me," she said softly but firmly. "This isn't just about us anymore. We need to end this now." Her husband looked at her, his brow furrowed with confusion and fear, but there was something else in his eyes, something that looked like understanding. She could see that he was beginning to piece things together. The facade was starting to crack, and the truth was leaking through the cracks. Her old friend turned to the investor with a sharp, calculating look. "You've made a mistake," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You thought you could run everything from behind the scenes, but this time, you've underestimated the wrong person." The investor's smile faded slightly as he took in her words, clearly unsure of what to expect next. "I've been in control of everything here," he said, his voice tight with irritation. "No one gets to dictate terms to me." The woman's old friend didn't flinch. "That's where you're wrong. We've been waiting for you to slip up. And now, it's time for you to face the consequences." With a swift motion, her friend reached into her bag and pulled out a small device, something the woman hadn't seen in years, but instantly recognized. It was a recorder, the kind used to collect evidence in situations just like this. Her old friend clicked a button, and the air in the room seemed to thicken with anticipation. A few moments later, the sound of a heavy door opening filled the room, and a few more figures appeared in the doorway. They were silent, their presence imposing, but it was clear they had a purpose. The woman's heart pounded as she realized that these were people from her past, people who had kept tabs on the investor, who had been quietly watching everything unfold from the shadows. The manager, who had been a pawn in this twisted game all along, looked from one person to another, his face pale and his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own guilt. I didn't know what I was getting involved in," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "I never meant for any of this to happen." The woman's old friend gave him a pitying look. "You didn't have to know. You were just a tool, just like Jake." At the mention of his name, Jake stiffened. He had been standing at the back of the room, watching everything unfold with increasing tension. His arrogance, the smugness that had been so prevalent in his demeanor, now vanished. He was no longer in control. In fact, he looked like he was beginning to realize that he had made a dangerous mistake. "What do you think you're going to do?" Jake sneered, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. "You think you can just walk in here and destroy everything we've built?" The woman stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with authority. "What you've built is nothing but a house of lies, and it's time for it to come down." Her old friend handed the recorder to one of the figures standing by the door, who immediately began playing the contents. The room fell silent as the voice of the investor echoed through the room. Voices from meetings that had taken place months ago, conversations about illegal activities, about money laundering and trafficking. It was all there, caught on tape. The investor's face turned an unnatural shade of white as the evidence mounted against him. His earlier confidence evaporated, replaced by the grim realization that his empire was crumbling before him. "You can't do this," he said, his voice shaking now. "You have no idea who I am, what I can do." "We know exactly who you are," the woman's old friend replied coldly. "And it's over." The sound of sirens outside the building confirmed what they all knew. There was no escape for the investor now. The authorities were on their way, and it was only a matter of time before everything would unravel. The room was thick with the finality of it all. Jake took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice faltering. "I never wanted this. I thought I could make something of myself." The woman's heart sank, but she knew there was no room for sympathy now. He had made his choices. The lies, the manipulation, the people he had hurt, none of it could be excused. She nodded toward her husband, signaling him to call the authorities. "It's time to take responsibility." As her husband stepped out of the room to make the call, the woman turned to face the investor and Jake one last time. "You had a chance to change, to make the right choices," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "But you didn't." The room grew quiet as the realization of what had happened settled in. The restaurant, once a symbol of success and a future they had built together, would never be the same. It would be stripped down to its foundations, rebuilt on truth and integrity. But it would take time. Time for healing, time for redemption, and time for forgiveness. As the authorities arrived and the last of the players in the twisted scheme were taken away, the woman stood by her husband, her eyes focused on the horizon. It had been a long, hard road, but they had made it through. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope. What they had gone through had been painful, but it had also opened their eyes to the truth. It was a truth that could no longer be hidden or ignored. And as the doors of the restaurant closed for the final time, the woman knew that this chapter of their lives was ending, but another was just beginning. With a deep breath, she turned to her husband and took his hand. Together, they would rebuild, not just their business, but their lives. And this time, they would do it right.